Hi, welcome. Today's lesson is on graphing. But before we begin, don't forget to be ready. Get a piece of paper and a pencil out or pen to take some notes down, and don't be shy to use that pause button or rewind button so you can follow along. For graphing, we're going to use a program called Plotly, Plot.ly. On your computer, go to that website. Once you get there, you need to create an account. It's free, so go ahead and do that. I've already created an account, so we're going to go to that. So here's my account, and we're going to start a new graph, so we want to find the button that says New. Sometimes it says New Project. And I'm going to push it, and it comes up with two choices, a plot or a grid. Well, a grid actually is where you put your data. So we're going to go to grid because we need to add some data so we can make a plot. A grid looks like a spreadsheet. So this is what you get for a grid. Column 1 says choose as X, and column 2 says choose as Y. So one of the first things we need to do is decide what data goes on the X-axis and what data goes on the Y-axis. If you remember, the independent variable goes on X and the dependent variable goes on Y. The independent variable is the one that you were in charge of, and the dependent variable is the one that you measured. I'm going to put in data, and to make it a little bit faster, I'm just going to copy and paste mine. But this is where you would enter your data. So there I have my data. Now, I can leave column 1 and column 2 listed as that, or they give me the option of naming them. I know that column 1 was my volume, so I am going to put in volume, milliliters. And I know my column 2 was mass. So I'm going to put that in here. If you forget to do this, you can actually add these on the graph itself. But there we have it, volume and mass. Now that I've got my data into my spreadsheet, I'm going to make the graph. So over here, it asks me some questions about the graph I'm going to make. And the option it gives first is line plot. We're very rarely going to use a line plot. So what kind of plot are we going to use? Most of the time, we're going to use a scatter plot. This allows us to do a trend line instead of a connect the dots kind of a plot. And that's what we're going to be looking for. Anytime you have numerical values on the X and Y axis, you'll probably do a scatter plot in this class. Error bars, all of these options here, we're not going to use now, but you can explore on your own. And so I'm going to make a new plot, and I'm going to hit this button here. It's going to make my scatter plot. So here I have my plot. Notice the volume and the mass are already labeled, but it didn't label. It says click to enter plot title. So I'm going to label that. We call our graphs in this class Y versus X. So whatever's on the Y-axis versus whatever's on the X-axis. So for this one, it's mass. And you don't have to write grams here in the title, but you do have to have grams in the label on the axis itself. So this is mass versus volume. So this is the minimum that you need to do. If you want to put more than that, mass versus volume for water, if you are measuring water, or for unknown liquid A, you can add more information, but the minimum is to put the Y versus the X, and I've done that. All right, so there's our graph, but we're not quite finished with it. We don't have any trend lines, and I don't really like the look of this graph as it is, so we're going to do some changes to this graph. So we're going to go to the top, and we're not saving or copying it yet. We're going to go to this section now and go through each of these buttons and see what we can change about the way our graph looks. So you can go to Traces, which talks about your data and the line that you're going to put in. I am going to go to the Style button and see what kind of choices I have. I could change the darkness of it, the opacity of it, or I can change the data points themselves. So if you do not like circles, you can change to something else. So let's change to something different. Let's make them little X's. And if you don't like the point size, you can make it bigger or smaller. And if you don't like the color blue, you can change that also. There we have it. I've made some changes. You can play around with the other buttons, but those are ones you might change. What can I do under the layout button? I could change the font and the size. So what if I don't like the way this font looks? I could change that. And if I didn't think that was a large enough font, I could make it larger. And I could change a whole bunch of things, but usually I'm not going to change that. Let's go to the next button. I don't like the fact that it really didn't give a nice box around our graph, or at least on the X and Y axis. And notice it didn't go down to 0, 0. If 0, 0 makes sense on your graph, you might want to add that. And it does. If I have 0 volume, I will have 0 mass. I might want to change the auto range to include the 0. You can also put in your own range in case you want to do that different. So I could put a minimum and maximum range. So I'm going to add the 0. Then I'm going to look at some of these other buttons, lines. I like to have axis lines. So that looks a lot nicer to me to have my X and my Y axis. You can put a mirror one. What does a mirror mean? That means you can put a line on the the right side and the top of your graph if you want to. But you don't have to. Grid lines. I like to have some grid lines. Those are some of the things I like to change with that. What is the next tab? It says ticks. Ticks are your grid lines. And right now we only have a very few grid lines. So I only have a line here, a line here, a line here. There's a big gap between 2 and 3. So I don't think that looks very good. So I want to add some more lines between that. Instead of having it do auto, which is what it looks like now, I'm going to change it to manual. I would like the spacing. I'd like to have more lines. So instead of every 1, a half, maybe you want to put every 0.2. I'm going to do 0.2 and see what it looks like. It may be too many, but I'm going to give that a try. I'm looking just at the x-axis for 0.2. So let's just do that for the x-axis. It did that for the y-axis, and as you can see, that looks horrible. So let's change these separately. So what about the y-axis? What kind of tick marks do I want on the y-axis? I want to have a lot less ticks. So let's do every 1 unit and see what that looks like. See if that's any better. Yes, that looks a lot better. So take a look at that. There we have it. So that looks a lot better. Those are our labels. Here is our layout. So I probably won't change anything else there. What about the notes? Notes means, do I want to write anything? Let's click on the notes, and it says click plus if we want to add annotation. So I'm going to click the plus button. Here it gives me some choices. Do I want my annotation to follow the page, or do I want to have it hooked onto this piece of data? Am I annotating this data or just the graph in general? If I just put my name on it, I just want it to go on the page. It normally puts an arrow by whatever text you add. I don't need an arrow pointing to my name, so I'm going to push the hide button. And then I could push this, and there's a whole bunch of things you can play around with doing, but I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to close this out, and there it has the new text. And I'm going to put my name at the top, and I don't want it to say new text. I want it to say Miss Backus. So there I have that, my graph. So we're getting closer to being done. We've looked at the style. We looked at the layout, the axis, the notes. What about the legend? So I'm going to click on legend. And a legend is important when you have more than one line. But I have one line. So a legend really isn't necessary. So I'm going to hide the legend. If you have multiple lines, you should label each line, but I don't. Wow, we're getting close to done with this one. Now I'm going to fit the data. This is where you add a trend line. So I'm going to look at my data, and I want to add a trend line to it. And let's take a look at our data. Does it look like it's a straight line? Does it look like a curve? I think it looks pretty straight to me. So then we're going to do linear. What are the other choices? Linear, polynomial, exponential, peak, inverse, and inverse squared. The ones we're probably going to use the most are linear and inverse, maybe inverse squared. I think this is linear, so we're going to push the linear. And it's going to give me a plus b times x is the format. And I'm just going to push this run this fit button. And this is the data it gives me. This r squared value is very important. It says how good your data is. If all of your points are exactly on the line, it will say 1. We have a r squared value of 0.9985. That's very close to 1. So that means our data is very good. Well, plus I just made it up. So, of course, it's going to be pretty good. I'm pleased with the line. So I'm going to add the results as a plot annotation because I want to see what that is. And then I'm going to push OK. Here is my graph, and it's looking pretty good. I have the mass, the volume, labels. I've got a title. I have the grid lines. And I might want to go back and make the grid lines a little darker. They're really faint, but that's an option. So here we have a graph, and I'm done with this now. So what's my next step? I need to save it, and I'm going to save this graph. So you can push the save button and save it somewhere into your documents. And then I probably want to put this graph into maybe a Word document, or shouldn't say Word anymore, probably a Google Doc. So I can export it, push the export button, and export it as a PNG, which is like a picture, or a PDF. And I can download it. I can also use an extension or an app. I have something called Awesome Screenshot, which you can add to your Chromebook. So if I just want to clip and paste it onto a Google Doc, I can highlight this, and I can capture it and then paste it somewhere else. You can do that. So those are different ways that you can save it and export it when you're done. Another feature I really like about this is that it's interactive in this form. If you want to interpolate, which is decide a value that wasn't a data point, you can go up and down your graph and you can get, there's the mass for this volume. So these are the 2 points that go together. So at 2.7959 milliliters, you should have a mass of 5.6796 grams. Way too many significant figures, but we haven't quite talked about that yet, but you'll learn that later on. So it does nice interpolation. Okay? It does not do extrapolation. That you would have to do on your own with the equation that it gives you. So y equals, this is your mx plus b value. So 2.06 would be my slope, and this would be my y-intercept. So there we have it, our graph. All right, just a few more things I want to add to this to show you before we leave Plotly. So I've already done a couple things. One, what if you want to have more than one line on the same graph? So what if I take 2 liquids that were labeled A and one was labeled B, and I took the mass at the same volumes for both? So I could have 2 lines. In case you want to have 3 lines or 4 lines or 5 lines, you can do that all in Plotly. Also, if I do a scatter plot for this, and I get a scatter plot, notice it will give me 2 lines, and I can go through the same process. I can add the labels and the title. I can fit the data for each of these, and now I can have 2 lines. One is for A and one is for B. What else can it do? Well, let's say we take another graph and it's not linear. What do I do then? I put in some more points, right? And once again, I'm going to go to scatter plot and hit the scatter plot. And notice this looks like a curve, not a straight line. So what do I do for that? Well, once again, you can add the title, labels, and all of that information. But what do you do about the trend line then? Let's add a trend line. It doesn't look linear to me, right? One of the things I said we often do if it's not linear is an inverse. Right? What if I think it looks like an inverse? As one goes up, the other goes down. That happens a lot in science. In physics, you get a lot of inverse squared functions also, but let's do the inverse. And now I have to be careful because it gives me some choices here for my inverse, which wasn't given for my linear. So which of these choices do I want? Probably this one in the middle will be the best one for you. And then we can run this fit. And there, once again, I have an r-squared value of 0.9994. And I have an equation that I can add to my graph. Often computer programs are really good at finding the exact equation, but that's not always the equation that we want in science. Sometimes we need a more simplified equation. You can still add it, but I want to have careful if it's not a linear graph. Sometimes we have problems with computer-generated equations for scientific information. But let's go ahead and add that. And once again, it's good at interpolating, right? So there you have it. We have plots that we did at the beginning, so this is what you should look like. You can make two lines, okay? You can do curves. If you're going to do two lines, go ahead and finish this graph off. I was just showing you that it can make two lines. So there we have it, single lines, double lines, and curves. Most of the things that you will run into while graphing in chemistry. Hope you learned a lot. If you have any questions, ask in class. Push the rewind. You can watch again. Thanks for listening. Hope you have fun graphing. I surely do.